Hey there again. So I realized in my last video my hair looked absolutely terrible, and I also wasn't really planning on doing another video. But honestly, it was pretty therapeutic, so I feel like going after another topic. And it's about the unhoused population in the United States. And I was in the car listening to NPR, and they're talking about community mental health, etc. And while I'm doing this, I'm in the parking lot of Safeway. There is a guy going ballistic, fighting another man, trying to steal his cans. And the one guy, he's like a homeless vet, looks like he's just doing his thing. The other guy is batshit. And here's my point, is that for those of you who don't understand why we're having the part of the housing crisis. Now, there's a housing crisis that is purely that, we have way too expensive of housing because there's a shortage, ergo our military vet who's collecting cans. And then we have the other housing crisis with people who are mentally ill. And the reason I wanted to talk about it, the reason I wanted to kind of go over community mental health today is to kind of help people understand where we're at. Is that we are in this doom loop. And for those of you who have lived in major cities, I lived in the Bay Area for 3 years, East Bay. I've lived in Portland, I've lived in Denver, I've lived in a lot of major cities. And here's what you notice. You notice that there are way more people addicted to drugs, fentanyl, etc. You see people who are mentally ill, you see people who are intoxicated. And this is even true for small towns. There's a guy in New Hampshire, and I'm not going to say his name, but he's like been arrested 2,000 times in the last 10 years and just keeps getting let out because he's mentally ill. And so you get into this point where people on the right are very anti major liberal cities, right? They're like, oh, well, that's because of their stupid liberal politics causing all these issues, and it's because of policing. That's not what it is. And then you have the left that says, well, we're trying to help and we're doing so well to try and help with community mental health, and it's not working. So what's really going on here? And it boils down to basically a historical answer. So what happened in the last 100 years to get us to this point? Why did we go to a community mental health based system, and what predated it? So for those of you who don't know historically speaking, back thousands of years ago, ancient Rome, etc., people just took care of their mentally ill relatives and typically they died. That's reality. By the time the medieval times rolled around and the ideas of hospitals started becoming a thing, they started trying to treat it as a malady a little bit. By the time what we would call the modern era, like the last 500 years, we're not dealing with this. We're throwing them all together in one spot and locking them behind bars because we don't want to deal with it. And 200 years ago, we really started getting into this asylum thing. But the crazy thing is there was kind of a revolution in the 1800s, which was called work-based therapy. And towards the end of the Victorian era in the United States, we started to see a little bit of these work-based programs to rehabilitate people who were more stable. So for anyone who's grew up in a town like I did with a huge mental health hospital, which is now closed, you'll be familiar with these stories of patients working with cows or farming their own stuff. And you're probably thinking, wow, must have been really cool they were able to do that. And here's the crazy thing, it worked really well. Almost as effectively as drug-based treatments. And so why did that go away? Well, that was 1890s, right? Right around that time period, pharmaceutical science went crazy advanced. And what happened is we could now give someone a drug that basically took care of whatever condition they had, whether it's psychosis, whatever, or at least they thought it did. There's a lot of it didn't work. But the reality is that the number of people that had to be institutionalized dropped like a rock in the early 1900s. And so what happened is by 1920s, 1930s, this is true for the United States and Europe, and I'm not so certain on what East Asian countries were doing or other parts of the world. But in the United States, it started becoming more violent offenders and people that we didn't have treatments for yet. So we start seeing these people going back onto the streets because we have these awesome pharmaceuticals. Here's the issue, though, is that we have all these people who are in these mental institutions that are not supposed to be there. So here's part of the problem in putting people into these institutions is that for a long time, you could kind of just put in there whoever you wanted. I mean that very literally. So you could have, for example, a husband commit his wife and say, she's insane, signed here on the dotted line for the state of whatever. In my hometown, this happened, and rather notoriously, this woman was sentenced to the mental hospital. She was sexually assaulted multiple times. She ended up taking her own life. It's really sad. My hometown also had a place where they would commit children, and now some of those children were also put there against their own will by their fathers. This happened until the 1960s, 1970s. It's pretty freaking dark. The reality is that the patriarchy, even if you don't like that word, whatever, it was very, very real. And you could commit family members with very little paperwork to these institutions. So what did that do to our society? Well, it got to a breaking point. And the book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is the one that everyone always talks about, even though the guy who wrote it actually basically self-admitted himself and like kind of asked them to do these things to him. So keep that in mind. And like Nurse Ratched is a fictional character, but she is based off of real people. If you haven't read it, please read it. The point is, though, in essence, a lot of these mental health facilities, the people who were working in them, they were unskilled labor, and in essence, they were sometimes torturing people or purposely abusing the means of treatment. That could be cold water therapy or shock therapy, etc., which there is actual validity to shock therapy. It's not just torture, but you can purposely be very mean with it. The point is that there is this breaking point. And pharmaceuticals were becoming more cheap, and by the 1960s and 70s, there were more for treating other things like psychosis, etc. And so at that point, Reagan comes around and he's like, well, we can cut this. We have the pharmaceutical companies, and we have the ability to give these on a community-based measure, and we can get rid of this system. And by the time Reagan was there, he was like the last nail in the coffin. But up until that point, everyone was dismantling it. It was very unpopular after kind of these revelations came out about what it's like in the mental health system. And here's where it gets tricky. At the same time, we had health insurance companies begin to raise rates very high. Something you and I deal with every day. And those very cheap, sometimes 100-year-old treatments for whatever mental ailment someone had suddenly became very expensive. Now keep in mind, a lot of medication cost cents on the dollar to produce. So the argument that pharmaceutical companies make that we have to keep prices expensive for research and development is a load of bullshit. Here's why. Is that most research and development is done by universities, and the reality is that most of these treatments have been around for 100 years or 60 or whatever. The point is the medications are not changing. If you're on lithium, that's been around a while. It's just realistic. A lot of these medications have existed. The reality is we live in a society where price gouging is just totally fine and completely unregulated. A lot of issues, not going to get into that. But so 1990s rolls around, early 2000s rolls around. The cost of these medications goes through the roof. On top of that, my generation, millennials, we also fought in 2 wars. People born between 1980 and 1995. Even though there's this big thing about boomers calling millennials lazy, even though we fought their wars for them. My point is that we had a new generation that went through a huge crisis, as well as people who were in New York City who experienced 9/11 and just the panic that the society had, on top of the people who were already vulnerable, not getting the medication they needed. And then the last, 15 years happened where medical costs have gone through the roof and we've had mass inflation. Add on top of that, a drug epidemic, you have a real issue. Now, self-medicating is a part of that, as part of the drug epidemic that we have. But the point is that we're at this point where community mental health is supposed to take on all of that, which is insane. My dad worked in public health. The public health departments across the United States, even though we just had a pandemic, have had their budgets cut pretty much since, I'm going to say, the Clinton administration, Bush administration. They've just continually had their budgets cut, which is insane considering we just had a massive pandemic. Maybe that's part of the reason why we didn't do so well. Anyways, my point is the expectation for community mental health to take care of this is insane. And then you get into the cultural aspect among psychiatrists, psychologists, and therapists, and that is liberties. And this is where the left and the right ideologically clash a lot, and it's the part where the biggest arguments come in. Here's the argument in a nutshell, is that the second that we stop giving equal liberties to people who are experiencing these mental episodes, typically they're homeless, and the second we take some of those liberties away, it's the slippery slope back to the Victorian age and like this, like, you know, brutal society where people were being thrown into these loony bins and pushed out of the light of society and being tortured. That's the argument from, I would call it, the educated progressive left. The right's argument is that, hey, I can't walk down the street with my kid without being assaulted by someone. This has to stop. And we are going to imprison these people and put them in huge prisons because they are criminals. And that's essentially the argument. And here's the problem with that. Both arguments are completely wrong. Imprisoning people who are mentally ill is not going to solve anything. It's just going to cause undue harm to them, and in essence is a form of torture itself. So for the people who are on the left saying like, oh, we can't take away any social liberties for them, keep in mind those people that you're claiming to protect are now ending up in prisons where they are not doing hot. So your effort to help them is not working. It's in fact backfiring massively. Or they're just becoming repeat offenders. Like I mentioned it earlier, there's a guy in New Hampshire, or Burlington, excuse me, and he's a repeat offender who's been on the street. He's been arrested 2,000 times within the last 10 years. I don't like dropping names like NPR does, just because I feel like it's kind of crappy thing to do, but that's where I heard from it originally. So both systems don't work. So the argument that there is that it's a slippery slope back to the days of going back to like some loony bin style, like mental institution thing, is the argument that the left says is the problem. And that the slippery slope of taking away personal liberties it's what's going to cause our society to do that again. I'm going to argue, number one, that unlike back then, we do have things like the internet, and we are a little bit more aware than we used to be, and we are a much more educated society because of it. So I think that's a pretty extreme argument. And I've also lived in other countries where they don't have these issues. Now, part of it is because of forced institutionalization. Part of it is because they have medicine for all. They have nationalized health insurance. People can get their medications and they don't go crazy to begin with. So my argument, if I was to try and solve this, is look at countries that have successful systems. We are certainly not one of them. The reality is that most of Europe just does not have these issues. Most of Asia does not have these issues for different reasons. They deal with it in a more familial-based way, and they use institutionalization more. My point is, though, that if your argument is either from the kind of leftist standpoint of the second you take away personal liberties is the erosion of everything, you have to recognize that with the people who are these repeat offenders, with the citizens who are living on the streets, it's a very ivory tower argument, and you come off as very, very arrogant saying it. You're the sort of person who lives in the East Bay and the Oakland Hills, but not in Oakland, or in New York City, but you actually live like in Long Island. Like, you don't actually know what it's like being on the street every day. You don't take the subway every day. You don't ride BART every day. You have no clue what you're talking about. You have no idea what it's like. So you can kind of stop with that argument. For the right, if your argument is we just need to throw all these people in prison and that we need to make our streets safer. Yes, we do need to make our streets safer, but throwing people and taking away personal liberties, which you should be very concerned about, the idea of personal liberties being taken away, is not the correct answer to that. The point is, we need to provide these medications to everyone so they can get them. For the people who are really far gone on that spectrum where medication isn't going to work, they need to have some form of institutionalization. And that's just the reality. And that's where I'm going to leave my video. You know, take it or leave it for what you will. Thanks for listening. Bye.